The good news is that ancient Egypt was one of history's most fascinating civilizations, with achievements that continue to baffle modern experts. The bad news is that almost everything you think you know about it is completely wrong. Hollywood, questionable History Channel documentaries, and that one weird kid from your 5th grade class who was really into mummies have collectively warped our understanding of this ancient civilization beyond recognition. Let's start with perhaps the most pervasive myth of all, that the pyramids were built by slaves. Spoiler alert, they weren't. I know. Your entire worldview is crumbling faster than a cookie in milk. But here's the archaeological truth bomb. The pyramid builders were actually skilled workers who were paid for their labor and even received proper burials near the pyramids themselves. Imagine applying for a job today, seeking physically fit individuals to drag massive limestone blocks across scorching desert. Benefits include daily bread rations, beer, and the overwhelming pride of building a fancy triangle for your God King's afterlife vacation home. Yet evidence from worker villages near the Giza Plateau shows these laborers were well-fed, received medical care, and were organized into specialized teams with colorful names like the Drunkards of Menkaure. Yes, ancient Egyptian construction crews had team names that would put your office softball league to shame. These weren't disposable slaves, but valued craftspeople. Farmers who worked during the Nile's annual flood when agricultural work was impossible, and full-time laborers who developed specialized skills in stone cutting, astronomy, and engineering. The logistics of pyramid building were mind-boggling even with willing workers. The Great Pyramid contains approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, averaging 2.5 tons each. That's roughly the weight of a modern SUV, except without the convenience of wheels, engines, or that annoying neighbor who keeps talking about his torque ratio, whatever that is. Workers moved these massive stones using ramps, sleds, and liberal application of physics, specifically reducing friction by wetting sand. A 2014 study showed that the right amount of moisture could reduce the force needed to pull the sleds by up to 50%. So next time you can't even drag yourself out of bed, remember that ancient Egyptians were figuring out sophisticated friction coefficients while hauling multi-ton rocks across the desert. What's your excuse for not making it to your 9 a.m. meeting? Ancient Egyptians didn't just have engineering prowess. They had excellent project management skills too. The pyramids weren't built by throwing unlimited human resources at the problem like your company does with that eternally behind software project. The workforce for the Great Pyramid is estimated at around 20,000 to 30,000 workers, not the hundreds of thousands often depicted in movies. These workers were organized into crews of about 2,000, further divided into smaller gangs of 200, and then into teams of around 20 people. Each had specific responsibilities and specialized skills. It was basically ancient Egypt's version of agile development, except instead of building apps that crash your phone, they built monuments that have survived for 4,500 years. Maybe we should send some Silicon Valley CEOs back in time for management training. Archaeological evidence at worker villages shows these laborers received medical care that would make some modern healthcare systems blush. Skeletal remains show healed fractures and evidence of successful surgeries, including brain surgery with survival rates that are honestly impressive for people working with copper tools and without antibiotics. Ancient Egyptian medical texts detail treatments for work-related injuries and illnesses. They even had paid sick leave. Meanwhile, in modern America, people are showing up to work with the plague because they can't afford to miss a day. Who's the advanced civilization again? The workers' diet was also surprisingly good. Analysis of their remains shows they ate plenty of protein in the form of meat, which was relatively expensive and not commonly consumed by the lower classes in ancient Egypt. What's particularly fascinating is that many of these workers inscribed their team names on blocks they placed, essentially signing their work. Imagine having that level of pride in your job today. This quarterly report was proudly compiled by the Excel warriors of marketing or the drunkards of accounting. These inscriptions weren't visible once the pyramids were completed. They were hidden inside the structure, not meant for human eyes. This suggests these weren't forced messages of propaganda, but genuine expressions of team identity and professional pride. Workers weren't faceless drones, but recognized contributors to a national project of immense cultural and religious significance. They were literally building for eternity, and they knew it. The seasonal nature of much of the pyramid workforce also demolishes the slave narrative. Many workers were farmers who couldn't work their fields during the annual Nile flooding, which submerged agricultural land for several months each year. Rather than twiddle their thumbs or invent Netflix several millennia early, these farmers took seasonal construction jobs on royal building projects. They received payment in the form of food, beer, clothing, and other goods, a sort of ancient Egyptian universal basic income program during their agricultural off-season. The state effectively created a massive public works program that provided employment, redistributed wealth in the form of rations, and produced monumental architecture that unified the kingdom culturally and religiously. It was infrastructure weak that lasted for centuries. Beer was actually part of workers' daily rations, with each laborer receiving up to 5 liters per day. Before you start planning your time travel vacation to party with pyramid builders, remember this wasn't your craft IPA with notes of pretentiousness and hints of economic privilege. Ancient Egyptian beer was lower in alcohol content, nutritionally dense, and safer to drink than water since the brewing process killed harmful bacteria. It was basically liquid bread with a slight buzz, ancient Egypt's version of a protein shake crossed with a light beer. Workers weren't stumbling around the construction site like freshmen at their first college party. They were consuming their daily calories in a form that wouldn't give them dysentery. Still, the image of thousands of workers building architectural wonders while moderately buzzed does put a new spin on those wonder of the world documentaries. The myth of slave-built pyramids is surprisingly recent in origin. Ancient Greek historians like Herodotus, often called the father of history, though father of historical gossip might be more accurate, never mentioned slaves building pyramids. The slave narrative gained traction in relatively modern times, particularly with Hollywood depictions and, yes, biblical associations that have no historical basis. The Bible mentions Hebrew slaves in Egypt, but never connects them to pyramid construction, and the timing doesn't even work historically. It's a bit like claiming George Washington had an iPhone. The chronology is just completely off. The Hebrew Exodus, if it occurred as described, would have been around the 13th century BCE, over 1,000 years after the Great Pyramid was completed. That's like attributing the Norman conquest to Queen Victoria. The persistence of the slave-built pyramid myth speaks to our modern assumptions about ancient societies and monumental architecture. We look at massive building projects and think, well, someone must have been oppressed to make this happen, which says more about our understanding of labor relations than it does about ancient Egypt. We struggle to comprehend how such impressive structures could be built without modern technology or exploitation. The reality that these monuments were built by a complex, socially stratified, but fundamentally cooperative society with sophisticated organizational capabilities challenges our narrative that civilization inevitably advances in a straight line from barbarism to modernity, with us conveniently at the pinnacle. The pyramids weren't built through tyrannical oppression, but through social cohesion around shared cultural and religious values. Even more fascinating, recent excavations at the worker villages have uncovered evidence that many laborers brought their families with them, suggesting these weren't prison camps, but functional communities. Archaeologists have found toys, cosmetics, and household items alongside tools and work materials. Workers lived in planned villages with organized housing, food production facilities, and even breweries. Priorities, right? The quality of housing varied based on skill level and position, creating a hierarchical but not enslaved workforce. There were overseers, skilled craftspeople, temporary laborers, and support staff who cooked, brewed beer, and made tools. It was basically a company town, but instead of mining coal or coding apps, they were building a stairway to heaven for their divine king. And unlike modern company towns, they probably weren't force-fed corporate propaganda in between shifts. Though admittedly, the divine king concept is perhaps history's most successful corporate branding campaign. So next time you see a movie showing whip-cracking overseers forcing thousands of groaning slaves to haul massive stones under the burning sun, remember it's about as historically accurate as dinosaurs with laser beams. The pyramids were built by paid workers with healthcare benefits, beer rations, and team spirit, using sophisticated engineering techniques developed through generations of knowledge accumulation. It wasn't slave labor, but human ingenuity, social organization, and cultural devotion that built these enduring monuments. The real miracle isn't that slaves could be forced to build something so magnificent. It's that a pre-industrial society could organize itself to accomplish such feats through cooperation and shared purpose. In our age of individualism and instant gratification, perhaps that's the most alien concept of all about ancient Egypt. The second most persistent myth about ancient Egypt is that King Tut's tomb was cursed, killing those who dared disturb his rest. Death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the peace of the king. Warned absolutely no inscription ever found in Tutankhamun's tomb. The curse of the pharaohs is basically the ancient world's version of that chain email your aunt keeps forwarding. Dramatically threatening, but completely made up. The entire curse narrative was fabricated by Western newspapers hungry for sensational stories to sell copies after Lord Carnarvon, the financial backer of Howard Carter's expedition, died several months after the tomb's discovery in 1922. Nothing gets papers flying off shelves like a supernatural revenge story featuring exotic foreign royalty, except maybe celebrity divorces or politicians doing literally anything. What the journalists conveniently ignored was that Howard Carter, the archaeologist who actually discovered and spent the most time in the tomb, lived for another 17 years after opening it. If there was a curse, it apparently had very specific terms and conditions that excluded the primary tomb disturber. It's like a haunted house that only targets people who didn't read the fine print. Carter died at age 64 from lymphoma, which, last I checked, isn't listed among the standard arsenal of ancient Egyptian curse weapons. The press also glossed over the fact that many others involved in the excavation lived long, healthy lives. Lady Evelyn Herbert, Lord Carnarvon's daughter who was among the first to enter the tomb, lived to the ripe old age of 79, dying in 1980, nearly 6 decades after allegedly incurring the wrath of the Boy King. Lord Carnarvon's death, which sparked the curse rumors, wasn't even particularly mysterious. He died from blood poisoning after a mosquito bite became infected, a sadly common occurrence in the pre-antibiotic era. The only curse involved was the curse of early 20th century medicine being slightly better than medieval bloodletting, but still worse than a WebMD self-diagnosis. Newspapers at the time reported that at the moment of Carnarvon's death, all the lights in Cairo mysteriously went out. They didn't. And his dog back in England howled and dropped dead. It didn't. It's almost as if journalists in the 1920s were practicing for today's social media misinformation campaigns, proving fake news was viral before viral meant anything beyond something that might kill you without penicillin. The curse myth was so profitable that when statistics failed to support it, they were simply ignored. A 2002 study published in the British Medical Journal examined the survival rates of 44 Westerners who could be identified as being present at the tomb's opening or during Carter's excavations. The researchers found no evidence of a curse. The Westerners involved with Tut's tomb lived just as long as those who stayed far away from it. In fact, the study found they lived slightly longer on average than their contemporaries who didn't go near Egyptian tombs. Perhaps disturbing ancient burial sites is actually good for your health? Don't expect to see that wellness trend at Goop anytime soon. Though I'd pay good money to watch Gwyneth Paltrow try to market pharaonic vitality dust extracted from genuine pyramid stones. Disclaimer, please don't actually steal parts of the pyramids. The curse narrative revealed more about Western attitudes toward Egypt than any actual Egyptian beliefs. In the 1920s, Egypt was still under British occupation, and the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb occurred against the backdrop of growing Egyptian nationalism and resistance to colonial rule. The curse story played into Orientalist tropes of Egypt as a land of mystery, danger, and irrational superstition. conveniently positioning Western archaeologists as rational scientists braving these exotic perils in the name of knowledge. Never mind that they were systematically removing cultural treasures from a country they were occupying. The curse provided a supernatural gloss over what was essentially a colonial enterprise, making it seem like an adventure story rather than archaeological looting under imperial power. Ancient Egyptians did include protective spells and warnings in tombs, but these were meant to deter and punish ancient tomb robbers, not future archaeologists, though the distinction might be semantics depending on your perspective on museum collections. These protections were primarily religious in nature, threatening punishments in the afterlife rather than immediate death by mysterious forces. Typical tomb inscriptions warned that robbers would be judged by the great god, or that their names would be erased from the land of the living. Nowhere do they mention the specific, immediate deaths of tomb violators that feature so prominently in Hollywood depictions. The ancient Egyptians were practical people. They knew the real deterrent to tomb robbery was hiding the entrance really well and threatening divine punishment, not promising instant death that would be disproven the moment a robber walked away unscathed. What's particularly ironic is that King Tut's tomb was actually one of the least impressive royal burial sites of ancient Egypt. Tutankhamun was a minor pharaoh who died young after a brief reign. His historical significance was minimal until Howard Carter found his tomb. The only reason Tut's burial remained relatively intact while greater pharaohs' tombs were thoroughly looted centuries earlier was that his successor hastily buried him in a small, unimpressive tomb that was quickly forgotten and accidentally covered by debris from later construction. It's the archaeological equivalent of finding a perfectly preserved Happy Meal because it fell behind the couch and nobody bothered looking for it. The richness of Tut's tomb, despite its small size and hasty preparation, only hints at how spectacular the tombs of major pharaohs like Ramesses' tomb must have been before looters got to them. The sensationalism surrounding Tut's curse also overshadowed the actual historical significance of the discovery. Carter's excavation was revolutionary in archaeological methodology. Unlike many earlier archaeologists who were essentially treasure hunters, Carter meticulously documented everything, taking photographs and notes on the precise location of each artifact before removing it. This context proved invaluable for understanding ancient Egyptian burial practices and religious beliefs. But archaeologists uses proper documentation methods isn't exactly a headline that sells newspapers. So instead, the public got Mummy's Curse claims another victim splashed across the front page every time anyone tangentially connected to the expedition stubbed their toe or caught a cold. The curse myth has been remarkably persistent, spawning countless books, films, and television episodes. Boris Karloff wrapped himself in bandages for The Mummy in 1932, and Hollywood hasn't stopped remaking it since. Each version seemingly more divorced from historical reality than the last. By the time Brendan Fraser was battling CGI swarms of flesh-eating scarabs, any connection to actual Egyptian beliefs had long disappeared. The Mummy's Curse became its own self-perpetuating cultural phenomenon, reinforcing Western perceptions of Egypt as mysterious and dangerous rather than a sophisticated civilization with complex religious beliefs and advanced scientific knowledge. It's a bit like if future civilizations based their understanding of American culture entirely on Sharknado movies. Ironically, while there was no supernatural curse, there were legitimate health hazards associated with entering ancient tombs that went unrecognized at the time. Sealed tombs could contain toxic mold spores, bat guano dust carrying histoplasmosis, or asphyxiating pockets of carbon dioxide. Ancient Egyptians also used various compounds in their embalming processes that could be harmful, including arsenic-based preservatives. None of these would cause immediate, dramatic deaths perfect for newspaper headlines, but they could certainly contribute to respiratory problems and infections in an era before face masks and OSHA regulations. The real curse was more likely garden-variety contamination and poor ventilation rather than angry mummy spirits. It's significantly less exciting for Hollywood, but much more plausible scientifically. The perseverance of the curse myth, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, speaks to our human love of a good story over boring facts. We want to believe in curses and supernatural vengeance, because ancient Egyptian religious practices become much more interesting if they actually had tangible power rather than being expressions of theological beliefs similar to those found in cultures worldwide. There's something deeply appealing about the idea that disturbing ancient remains might have consequences beyond academic debates about archaeological ethics. It suggests a world where justice has cosmic enforcement, where desecration is automatically punished without the need for human legal systems. It's the archaeological version of karma, immediate and dramatically satisfying in a way that real life rarely is. The reality is that if ancient Egyptian curses were effective, we'd have significantly fewer mummies in museums around the world. The Cairo Museum alone would be surrounded by piles of mysteriously deceased tourists if simply viewing displaced artifacts could trigger supernatural retribution. The British Museum would be a ghost town in the most literal sense. Yet millions of visitors gawk at mummified remains and grave goods every year without suffering anything worse than sore feet and overpriced gift shop merchandise. Perhaps the real curse is paying £15 for a bookmark with hieroglyphics on it. The next time someone tries to scare you with tales of Tutankhamun's revenge, remind them that the most dangerous thing in most Egyptian tombs was probably the gift shop exit strategy, carefully designed to funnel you past overpriced scarab paperweights. And my friend visited ancient Egypt, and all I got was this lousy papyrus t-shirts. Speaking of things that make historians want to tear their hair out, let's talk about aliens. Yes, aliens. Those convenient explanation for anything humans supposedly couldn't have built themselves. According to certain documentary channels that have long abandoned any relationship with actual history, the pyramids were either built by extraterrestrials, built for extraterrestrials, or built by humans with alien technology, because apparently it's easier to believe in interstellar travel than in human ingenuity. This third myth about ancient Egypt, that aliens were involved in their architectural achievements, is perhaps the most insulting to both ancient Egyptians and your intelligence. It's the historical equivalent of saying, "I don't understand how this works." So clearly magic space beings did it, which is essentially the ancient astronaut theorist's entire playbook. The alien theory goes something like this. The pyramids are so precisely aligned with the stars and built with such massive stones fitted so perfectly together that primitive humans simply couldn't have managed it. Therefore, aliens. This logic has more holes than Swiss cheese that's been used for target practice. First, let's address the primitive humans assumption, which is both racist and historically inaccurate. By the time Egyptians built the pyramids, they had already been developing their civilization for over 1,000 years. They had mathematics, astronomy, sophisticated writing systems, and specialized labor forces. Calling them primitive is like calling Einstein kind of smart, a criminal understatement. The Great Pyramid wasn't their first architectural rodeo. It was the culmination of centuries of engineering evolution, with earlier attempts literally visible in the archaeological record. The precision of the Great Pyramid's alignment, its sides oriented almost perfectly to the cardinal directions with an error of less than 0.05 degrees, is indeed impressive. But ancient Egyptians didn't need alien GPS to achieve this. They had a thorough understanding of astronomical observation. By tracking the stars' movements, particularly circumpolar stars that never set below the horizon, they could establish true north with remarkable accuracy. They also had something many modern humans seem to lack: patience. These alignments weren't accomplished overnight with laser beams from UFOs, but through careful observation and measurement over time. They had the revolutionary concept of checking their work, a technique apparently alien to many modern construction projects, judging by the state of my apartment's bathroom tile. Then there's the issue of the massive stones and their precise fitting. Yes, some pyramid blocks weigh several tons, but as we've already covered, the Egyptians had sophisticated techniques for moving heavy objects. They didn't need anti-gravity devices or tractor beams. They had ramps, rollers, sleds, and thousands of strong humans working together. As for the precise fitting, that's what happens when you employ skilled stonemasons who take pride in their work and aren't rushing to meet an end-of-quarter deadline. The blocks weren't prefabricated by space factories. They were carefully cut, transported, and then further shaped on-site for optimal fitting. It's amazing what humans can accomplish when they're not distracted by Instagram notifications or binge-watching streaming services. The alien theory also conveniently ignores the extensive archaeological evidence of human construction. We have actual worker villages, tools, organizational hieroglyphs, and even graffiti from the workers themselves. There are quarries with half-cut stones still in place, showing exactly how the work was done. We found copper chisels, dolerite pounding stones, wooden mallets, and other tools used in construction. None of these artifacts feature suspicious green goo, mysterious energy sources, or labels reading property of Zorg from the Andromeda Galaxy. What we do have is abundant evidence of human labor, organization, and engineering knowledge, which is apparently less exciting than little green men with atom-powered stone levitators. If aliens were involved, they were remarkably thorough about planting fake evidence of human construction while leaving absolutely zero evidence of their own existence. The aliens built the pyramids theory reveals more about modern arrogance than ancient realities. It stems from the inability to believe that people without smartphones and TikTok could accomplish monumental feats of engineering. This attitude is deeply ethnocentric, suggesting that technological advancement only counts if it looks like our specific version of technology. Ancient Egyptians didn't have computers or power tools, but they had something possibly more valuable: multi-generational knowledge accumulation and transfer. Each building project improved on the last, with techniques refined over centuries. They didn't have YouTube tutorials, but they had direct apprenticeship systems where knowledge was passed down through practice. Their project management wasn't done in Asana or Trello, but it was no less sophisticated for its time. Perhaps the most glaring hole in the alien theory is the clear evolution of pyramid design visible in the archaeological record. If super advanced aliens swooped down to show humans how to build perfect pyramids, why do we see so many failed attempts and gradual improvements? The earliest pyramids, like the Step Pyramid of Djoser, show experimental designs quite different from later, smooth-sided versions. Some early pyramids partially collapsed during construction, showing evidence of engineering problems that were solved in later buildings. The bent pyramid literally changes angle partway up because architects realized their initial design was unstable. This is exactly what you'd expect from humans learning through trial and error, not what you'd expect from beings advanced enough for interstellar travel. Unless the aliens were particularly sadistic and enjoyed watching humans struggle through architectural growing pains for their cosmic reality show, Egypt's got pyramid talent. The alien theory also ignores the simple fact that other ancient civilizations around the world built similarly impressive structures without any supposed extraterrestrial assistance. The Mayans, Chinese, Cambodians, and many others all created monumental architecture using techniques appropriate to their environments and available materials. Are we to believe aliens were just really into helping humans stack big rocks in impressive patterns worldwide? If aliens were so invested in human architecture, you'd think they might have shared some truly advanced technology, like indoor plumbing or antibiotics, rather than just helping with particularly ambitious masonry projects. Here's how to build a massive pointy tomb, but we'll keep the cure for plague to ourselves seems like an oddly specific form of technological sharing. What's particularly ironic about the alien theory is that it actually diminishes the true wonder of the pyramids. The most impressive thing about these structures isn't that they exist, it's that they were built by humans using the resources and knowledge available to them at that time. The real miracle is human collaboration, ingenuity, and determination, not extraterrestrial intervention. When we attribute these achievements to aliens, we rob our ancestors of their rightful place in history and undervalue the incredible capabilities of our own species. It's actually far more awe-inspiring to recognize that humans working together with relatively simple tools could create something so enduring and precise than to imagine it was all done with some magical space technology. The persistence of the alien theory, despite overwhelming archaeological evidence to the contrary, speaks to a modern failure of imagination. We've become so dependent on our technology that we can't conceptualize achievement without it. We struggle to understand how people could coordinate massive projects without email, perform precise measurements without lasers, or move heavy objects without hydraulic machinery. This technological dependency has ironically limited our ability to appreciate the diverse ways human intelligence can manifest. Ancient Egyptians didn't have our tools, but they had different ones suited to their needs. They didn't have our knowledge, but they had specialized knowledge we've largely lost. Their achievements weren't lesser than ours, just different, adapted to their time and place in history. Let's be clear. If aliens had visited ancient Egypt, they probably would have left more evidence than suspiciously well-built triangles. No alien artifacts, materials, or technologies have ever been found in Egypt despite centuries of intensive archaeological investigation. No Egyptian texts mention visitors from the stars, and they wrote about everything. No bizarre radioactive residues or unknown elements have been detected in pyramid stones. The evidence for alien involvement consists entirely of modern people saying, "I don't understand how they did this, so aliens." This is the very definition of an argument from ignorance, using a lack of personal understanding as evidence for an extraordinary claim. It's like saying, "I don't understand how my car works, therefore magical elves must power it." The appropriate response to not understanding something isn't to invent fantasy explanations, but to research and learn. So the next time you hear someone confidently explaining how aliens must have built the pyramids because humans just weren't capable of such feats, remember they're not just wrong about ancient Egypt. They're wrong about humanity. The pyramids stand as testimony to what humans can achieve through cooperation, knowledge sharing, and determined effort over generations. They remind us that our species has always been capable of greatness, with or without modern technology. The real question isn't how aliens built the pyramids. It's whether we modern humans, for all our technological advantages, could muster the social cohesion and multi-generational commitment to create something equally enduring. Perhaps instead of looking to the stars for explanations, we should look to our own history for inspiration and recognize that the most advanced technology isn't always digital or mechanical, but sometimes social and organizational. Myth number 4. Ancient Egyptians were obsessed with death. According to popular imagination, Egyptians spent their entire lives preparing for death, thinking about death, building monuments to death, and generally being the world's first documented goths. If Hollywood is to be believed, ancient Egyptians never smiled, only wore eyeliner to look more corpse-like, and spent their weekends comparing notes on the best embalming techniques over drinks. How's your canopic jar collection coming along? Amenhotep? I just got a new alabaster set for my liver and lungs. This death-obsessed characterization isn't just wrong, it's precisely backward. Ancient Egyptians weren't fixated on death. They were wildly, passionately, almost desperately in love with life. Their elaborate burial practices weren't about death worship, but about their fervent desire to continue living. The confusion stems from the fact that most surviving Egyptian structures are tombs and temples. This creates a sampling bias that would be like future archaeologists concluding that 21st century Americans were obsessed with parking their cars because parking lots are the most expansive structures in our cities. Egyptian houses, markets, and everyday buildings were made from mud brick, which tends to dissolve back into mud after a few thousand years of Nile floods and desert winds. Meanwhile, structures built for eternity were made from stone specifically chosen for its durability. What we're seeing isn't their preoccupation with death, but their architectural pragmatism. Use temporary materials for temporary needs and permanent materials for things you want to last forever. It's not the Egyptians' fault that archaeologists thousands of years later would completely misinterpret this practical building code distinction. A glimpse into actual Egyptian houses reveals a people who loved vibrant colors, comfortable furnishings, gardens, and entertainment. Walls were painted with scenes of nature, hunting, fishing, and banqueting. They had board games like Senate, played music on harps and flutes, and enjoyed dancing and acrobatic performances. They wore colorful clothing, jewelry, and makeup not just for religious purposes, but because they enjoyed looking fabulous. Homes featured pools, gardens with shade trees, and rooftop sleeping areas for hot summer nights. This doesn't sound like a culture preoccupied with mortality, but rather one that embraced sensory pleasures and comfortable living. They weren't the Addams family with pyramids. They were more like well-organized hedonists with excellent architectural skills and a solid retirement plan that extended into the afterlife. Even their religious texts reveal this life-affirming attitude. The Egyptian Book of the Dead, which they actually call the Book of Coming Forth by Day. See how translations can change everything? Isn't about death at all, but about successfully navigating the afterlife to ensure continued existence. The spells and instructions it contains aren't meant to celebrate death, but to overcome it entirely. The ultimate goal wasn't to be dead, but to live eternally in the field of reeds. A perfect version of Egypt where the weather was always pleasant, the crops always abundant, and presumably the Wi-Fi signal always strong. The elaborate mummification process, the tomb goods, the funerary texts, all were designed not to worship death, but to deny its permanence. It was the ancient Egyptian version of turning to the Death Star and defiantly saying, "Not today." Food and drink featured prominently in both daily life and afterlife preparations, further highlighting their life-loving nature. Egyptians brewed at least 17 varieties of beer and produced numerous wines, which they consumed with enthusiasm at banquets, religious festivals, and regular meals. They believed in eating, drinking, and being merry so sincerely that tomb walls were decorated with scenes of elaborate feasts to magically ensure their continuation after death. They weren't thinking, "Remember, you will die." They were thinking, "Remember to bring enough beer for eternity." Tombs were stocked with bread molds, brewing equipment, and food provisions because the afterlife was imagined as a place where you'd still want your favorite snacks and beverages. Their version of heaven wasn't an austere spiritual plane, but essentially an endless all-inclusive resort where the buffet never closed and your favorite beer was always on tap. Their sexual attitudes were similarly life-affirming. Far from being prudish, ancient Egyptians celebrated sexuality as a natural, pleasurable part of existence. They had love poetry that would make modern romance novelists blush, with lines like, "Your love has penetrated all within me, like honey plunged into water." Turin Papyrus, in case you're wondering. Fertility was celebrated, contraception was practiced, and sexual pleasure was considered a normal aspect of a healthy life. Even their creation myths often involved sexual acts between deities. The god Min was depicted with a permanent erection, which probably made the other gods awkward at divine staff meetings, but certainly suggests the Egyptians weren't sexually repressed. Their afterlife included continued sexual activity, because what kind of eternal paradise doesn't include intimacy? They weren't obsessed with death. They were determined that even death wouldn't stop them from enjoying life's pleasures. Egyptian medical practices also reveal their love of life. They developed extensive medical knowledge, recorded in papyri that detail hundreds of ailments and treatments. They had specialists for different parts of the body, performed surgeries, set broken bones, and created pharmacological remedies from plants and minerals. Some of their medical treatments were surprisingly effective, while others were about as medically sound as those doctors react videos on TikTok. But the important point is they were actively trying to preserve and extend life, not hurry anyone along to the tomb. They had designated physicians for the living, not just embalmers for the dead. Their medical texts focus on healing and maintaining health. Further evidence of a culture that valued life and actively fought against death and disease rather than passively accepting or worshiping mortality. Their social practices further demolish the death obsession myth. Egyptians loved parties and festivals, with religious calendars providing ample opportunities for celebration. The beautiful Festival of the Valley, for example, involved visiting ancestors' tombs, but it wasn't a somber occasion. It was essentially a family reunion with food, music, dancing, and enough alcohol to make everyone temporarily forget about that awkward thing Uncle Tahotep said last year. These celebrations included not just the elite, but people from all social levels. Even workers at places like Deir el Medina, the village of pyramid builders, were given days off for festivals. Ancient Egypt apparently had better work-life balance than many modern companies. Sorry, boss, can't come in today. It's the festival of drunkenness. Religious obligation, you understand. The Egyptian concept of ma'at, truth, balance, and order, guided their approach to life and emphasized living well in the present. Ma'at wasn't about preparing for death, but about maintaining cosmic and social harmony through ethical living, truthfulness, and justice. When Egyptians did contemplate death, it was primarily through the lens of how their actions in life would affect their eternal existence. The famous negative confessions in the Book of the Dead, where the deceased declared all the wrongs they had not committed. I have not stolen, I have not killed, I have not cut in line at the pyramid gift shop, were essentially a moral scorecard meant to ensure continued existence. They weren't obsessing over death. They were making sure their ethical behavior in life would qualify them for the eternal all-inclusive resort package rather than the economy package that involved being eaten by a soul-devouring monster. Even mummification itself wasn't about fetishizing death, but preserving life. The elaborate process of removing organs, drying the body, wrapping it in linen, and placing it in a protective coffin was all designed to keep the body intact so the person's life force and personality could reunite with it. It was essentially ancient cryonics without the freezing, a way to keep the physical body available for future reanimation. The Egyptians would probably look at our modern burial practices of letting bodies decompose naturally and think we're the ones with unhealthy attitudes toward death. You just put your grandmother in a box and let her rot? What is wrong with you people? Don't you want her to enjoy the field of reeds with all her original parts? At the very least, save her liver in a nice canopic jar. It's just common decency. What's particularly interesting about the death-obsessed myth is how it reveals our own cultural projections. Western culture, particularly since the Victorian era, has developed complicated and often unhealthy relationships with death, simultaneously denying its reality while being morbidly fascinated by its details. We've banished death from daily life, relegating it to hospitals and funeral homes, while simultaneously consuming endless murder mysteries, crime shows, and horror films. We're the ones with the death fixation, and we've projected it backward onto a culture that actually had a much more integrated and balanced view. The Egyptians didn't whisper about death or pretend it didn't exist. They acknowledged it as a transition to be prepared for, not unlike how you might prepare for retirement by setting up a 401k, except their version included magical spells and a heart-weighing ceremony. So next time someone characterizes ancient Egyptians as death-worshipping proto-goths obsessed with mummies and tombs, remember they were actually vibrant, pleasure-loving people who enjoyed beer, sex, parties, board games, and living in comfortable, beautifully decorated homes. They built massive tombs not because they loved death, but because they loved life so much they wanted to continue it forever. Their elaborate preparations for the afterlife weren't morbid obsessions, but the ultimate expression of their desire that the party should never end, even when the physical body wore out. In their determination to overcome death's limitations rather than submit to them, the ancient Egyptians might actually have been the world's first transhumanists, minus the Silicon Valley funding and dubious supplements. They weren't waiting around to die. They were planning how to keep living their best lives for eternity, with all their favorite snacks, beverages, and board games included in the package. Among the pantheon of persistent ancient Egyptian myths, here's a classic. Cleopatra was Egyptian. She ruled Egypt, had that iconic Egyptian eyeliner, seduced Caesar with her exotic Egyptian ways, and died by the bite of an Egyptian ASP while lounging in her Egyptian palace. Right? Well, surprise. Cleopatra, 7 Filipater, was about as Egyptian as a Wisconsin cheese pizza is Italian. She was Greek. So Greek, in fact, that she was the first ruler in her dynasty who actually bothered to learn the Egyptian language, despite her family having ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years. Prior Ptolemaic rulers were apparently content to gesture vaguely at their Egyptian subjects while speaking Greek and pretending they weren't essentially foreign occupiers with fancy titles and really nice hats. Cleopatra belonged to the Ptolemaic dynasty, founded by Ptolemy Isoter, a Macedonian Greek general who served under Alexander the Great. When Alexander died in 323 BCE after conquering pretty much everything he could reach without falling off the edge of the maps available at the time, his generals carved up his empire like vultures at an all-you-can-eat carrion buffet. Ptolemy grabbed Egypt, declared himself pharaoh, and established a dynasty that would last until Cleopatra's death in 30 BCE. For nearly 3 centuries, these Greek rulers governed Egypt while maintaining their Hellenic culture, speaking Greek, worshipping Greek gods, alongside Egyptian ones when politically convenient, and generally acting like college students on an extremely extended study abroad program who refused to integrate with the locals. The Ptolemies took cultural isolation to impressive extremes, creating what was essentially a Greek bubble in the Egyptian landscape. They built the city of Alexandria to serve as their capital, a distinctly Greek city on Egyptian soil, complete with Greek architecture, Greek institutions like the famous library, and a predominantly Greek population. Meanwhile, the vast majority of actual Egyptians continued living as they had for millennia, speaking Egyptian, worshipping Egyptian gods, and probably rolling their eyes every time a new Ptolemy came to power and butchered the pronunciation of traditional royal titles. It was cultural appropriation without the appropriation. They took the titles and wealth without adopting the culture. Imagine if the British royal family ruled India for 3 centuries while speaking only English, living in London-style palaces in Delhi, and only the last monarch bothered to learn Hindi. That's essentially what the Ptolemies did in Egypt. Cleopatra's family tree was about as Egyptian as the Thames River. Her ancestry was Macedonian Greek on both sides, with a family that practiced inbreeding to a degree that would make even the most dedicated royal genealogist wince uncomfortably. The Ptolemies married brother to sister with such regularity that their family tree resembled a particularly ambitious piece of Celtic knotwork. Cleopatra's parents were likely siblings, which was considered scandalous not in Egypt, where royal sibling marriage had precedent, but among Greeks everywhere else. When your family's marital practices shock even your own cultural group, you might be taking dynastic purity a bit too far. Cleopatra herself married 2 of her brothers in succession, though these were political arrangements rather than romantic relationships, which probably made those royal family dinners slightly less awkward, but only slightly. What made Cleopatra exceptional among the Ptolemies wasn't her non-existent Egyptian heritage, but her political savvy and cultural adaptability. Unlike her ancestors who remained proudly, stubbornly Greek, Cleopatra embraced Egyptian culture as a political strategy. She learned to speak Egyptian, participated in Egyptian religious ceremonies, and presented herself to the Egyptian population as a true pharaoh rather than just another foreign ruler collecting taxes. This wasn't because she was secretly Egyptian or felt some deep connection to her adopted homeland's ancient traditions. It was because she was smart enough to recognize that winning the support of the Egyptian population would strengthen her political position. It was less cultural appreciation and more shrewd marketing. The ancient equivalent of a politician suddenly developing an interest in local sports teams during election season. Cleopatra's famous appearance has been equally mythologized and Egyptianized in popular culture. Elizabeth Taylor's iconic portrayal with elaborate Egyptian-style makeup and costumes bears little resemblance to how the historical Cleopatra likely presented herself. Contemporary descriptions mention her charisma, intelligence, and melodious voice rather than stunning beauty, and surviving coins bearing her image show a woman with a prominent nose and strong features that wouldn't meet Hollywood's narrow beauty standards. She probably dressed in Greek royal fashion for Greek audiences and in Egyptian royal regalia for Egyptian audiences, a shrewd political chameleon rather than an exotic Egyptian temptress. Her famous seduction of Caesar likely had more to do with her intellectual brilliance and political acumen than with any exotic allure or Egyptian sex magic, though that certainly makes for less exciting film scenes. Even Cleopatra's legendary death by ASP bite has been questioned by historians. While dramatic and fitting for a ruler associating herself with Egyptian royal symbols, the uraeus, or cobra, was a symbol of Egyptian royalty. It may be another embellishment. Historical accounts vary, with some suggesting she used a poisonous ointment or simply took poison rather than employing a theatrical snake. The ASP story made for a better narrative in Roman accounts, linking her to Egyptian symbols while portraying her death as exotic and foreign rather than the calculated political move it actually was. Cleopatra chose suicide over the humiliation of being paraded through Rome in Octavian's triumph, maintaining control over her destiny until the end. It was her final political act, not a mystical Egyptian death ritual. Whether by snake, poison, or other means, she died a Greek woman making a Greek choice about honor and dignity, albeit one who had become more culturally flexible than her ancestors. The real Cleopatra was a political genius who spoke 9 languages, authored books on weights and measures, and commanded armies and navies in addition to seducing 2 of Rome's most powerful men. She wasn't some exotic Egyptian temptress, but a highly educated Greek woman who used every available tool, including cultural adaptation, strategic relationships, and her formidable intellect, to maintain her kingdom's independence against the expanding Roman Republic. She nearly succeeded, too. Had the Battle of Actium gone differently, we might now be discussing the Ptolemaic Roman Empire rather than just the Roman one. She didn't fail because she was too busy applying eyeliner and bathing in milk. She failed because Octavian, later Augustus, had more legions and better weather on the day of the decisive naval battle. Even in defeat, she managed to dictate the terms of her own end rather than submitting to Rome's plans for her. The persistent myth of Cleopatra as Egyptian reveals our cultural tendency to exoticize and simplify historical figures, particularly women. It's easier to portray her as a mysterious, seductive foreigner using feminine wiles and exotic charms than as what she actually was, a brilliant polyglot stateswoman navigating complex political waters while trying to preserve her kingdom's independence. The Egyptian presentation was her political strategy, not her identity. Yet almost every film portrayal focuses on her romantic relationships and exotic allure rather than her political and intellectual achievements. It's the ancient historical equivalent of reducing a female CEO to stories about her fashion choices and dating history, while ignoring her business acumen. Cleopatra deserves better, even 2 millennia after her death. What's particularly fascinating about the real Cleopatra is how thoroughly she's been mythologized within her own lifetime and immediately after her death. Roman propaganda under Octavian portrayed her as a foreign seductress who ensnared Mark Antony with exotic charms and luxury, nearly bringing Rome to ruin. This narrative conveniently ignored the fact that Rome had been embroiled in civil wars for decades before Cleopatra entered the picture, and that Antony's alliance with her made strategic sense given Egypt's wealth and resources. The Romans needed a foreign scapegoat for their internal problems, and a Greek queen playing at being Egyptian provided the perfect exotic villain. The Romans effectively created the Egyptian Cleopatra myth as political propaganda, and we've been repeating it ever since, with each retelling adding more eyeliner and less historical accuracy. The irony is that while Cleopatra wasn't Egyptian by blood, she probably did more to honor and preserve authentic Egyptian culture than many of her predecessors. She participated in Egyptian religious ceremonies, supported traditional temples, and presented herself as a divine pharaoh in the ancient Egyptian tradition. Unlike earlier Ptolemies who remained culturally isolated in Alexandria, she traveled throughout Egypt and engaged directly with Egyptian subjects. Her identification with the goddess Isis wasn't just political theater, but part of a genuine effort to bridge Greek and Egyptian religious traditions. So while she wasn't Egyptian by ancestry, she made more effort to respect and continue Egyptian cultural traditions than any Ptolemy before her. She may not have been Egyptian, but she was arguably a better ruler for Egypt than her more obviously Greek ancestors who treated the country merely as a personal treasury. Ultimately, the myth of Egyptian Cleopatra persists because it's more interesting than the complex historical reality. A mysterious Egyptian queen using ancient seduction techniques and exotic knowledge to ensnare Roman generals makes for better movies than a pragmatic Greek politician making strategic alliances to preserve her kingdom's autonomy. The exotic Orientalist fantasy is easier to market than the historical woman who wrote mathematical treatises and could switch between languages mid-conversation to better negotiate with foreign diplomats. But the real Cleopatra, Greek, multilingual, politically savvy, and intellectually brilliant, is far more impressive than the mythologized version. She wasn't great because she was an exotic Egyptian temptress. She was great because she was a diplomatic genius, playing a weak hand masterfully on the stage of Mediterranean power politics. She nearly succeeded in preserving her kingdom's independence against impossible odds, and that's far more impressive than any amount of snake charming or milk bathing that Hollywood might attribute to her. Let's tackle another ridiculous misconception: the idea that ancient Egyptians believed cats were gods. According to internet memes, and that one person at every party who took an introductory archaeology class 10 years ago, Egyptians spent their days prostrating themselves before fluffy felines, building elaborate cat temples, and essentially acting like today's Instagram cat influencers, but with more hieroglyphics and fewer sponsor posts. The truth? Cats weren't gods in ancient Egypt. They were associated with gods, specifically the goddess Batet. But the Egyptians no more worship cats than Christians worship lambs because Jesus is called the Lamb of God. Ancient Egyptians were sophisticated theologians with complex religious beliefs, not a civilization of crazy cat people who somehow managed to build pyramids between episodes of Egypt's Got Feline Talent. The confusion stems from the Egyptian practice of depicting certain deities with animal attributes or heads. Batet, initially a fierce lioness goddess of warfare, gradually evolved into a more domestic cat goddess associated with home, fertility, and protection. This transformation mirrored the domestication of cats in Egyptian society, reflecting their cultural significance rather than indicating literal cat worship. Other deities had animal associations too. Horus had a falcon head, Anubis a jackal head, Thoth an ibis head, and Sobek a crocodile head. By the logic that claims Egyptians worship cats, we'd also have to conclude they worship falcons, jackals, ibises, crocodiles, and pretty much the entire contents of a modern zoo. What they actually worshipped were complex divine principles and cosmic forces that were symbolically represented through animal imagery, not the animals themselves. Cats were certainly valued in Egyptian society, but for predominantly practical reasons that any modern urban dweller with a rodent problem would understand. In an agricultural civilization centered around grain storage, cats were essential for controlling mice and rat populations that threatened food supplies. A good mouser was worth its weight in grain, literally, as it protected far more food than it consumed. Cats also killed snakes, another significant threat in Egyptian households. These practical benefits led to cats being protected and appreciated, much like working animals in any agricultural society. The leap from useful animal we should treat well to divine being we must worship is about as logical as assuming modern Americans worship combine harvesters because they're crucial to agricultural production. All hail the mighty John Deere, bringer of abundant corn and soy. The sacred status of cats has been wildly exaggerated in popular culture. Yes, killing a cat in ancient Egypt could bring severe punishment, but this was less about religious reverence and more about protecting valuable animals that serve important functions in society. It would be like someone deliberately destroying farm equipment or poisoning livestock. You're damaging important resources, not committing cosmic blasphemy. Egyptians did mummify cats, but this practice primarily exploded during the late period 664 to 332 BCE, when animal mummification became a massive industry. People would purchase mummified animals as offerings to related deities, essentially buying a token of devotion rather than worshiping the animal itself. It was the ancient equivalent of lighting a candle at church or leaving flowers at a shrine, not evidence that they believed Fluffy was literally divine. The industrial scale of cat mummification actually undermines the notion that Egyptians revered all cats as sacred beings. Archaeologists have discovered cat cemeteries containing hundreds of thousands of mummified cats, many of which were deliberately bred and killed young specifically for the mummification industry. Analysis of these mummies reveals that many cats were under a year old when killed, suggesting they were raised specifically for this purpose rather than being beloved pets who died naturally. This wasn't the careful preservation of revered divine beings, but a religious manufacturing operation closer to modern souvenir production. If you're breeding animals specifically to kill and mummify them as religious offerings, you clearly don't believe each individual animal is itself divine. It would be like printing billions of Bible copies specifically to burn them, not an action consistent with believing each physical book is sacred. The irony is that the real relationship between Egyptians and cats was more nuanced and interesting than the simplistic "they worship cats" narrative. Cats in ancient Egypt occupied a space somewhere between valued working animals, household companions, and symbols of divine attributes. They appeared in tomb paintings going about normal cat activities, hunting birds in marshy areas, lounging under chairs during family gatherings, or keeping company with their owners. Some were given names like Sweet One or Little Darling, suggesting genuine affection. Female cats were associated with Bastet's qualities of fertility, protection, and domestic harmony, while male cats were sometimes linked to the sun god Ra in his role as defender against the serpent of chaos, Apophis. Cats symbolically embodied certain divine principles without being considered divine themselves. Much like how eagles symbolize American freedom, without Americans thinking each individual bald eagle is a reincarnation of George Washington. Archaeological evidence shows that some cats were indeed kept as pets and mourned when they died. Wealthy Egyptians occasionally mummified their favorite cats and buried them with food offerings or even had them depicted in their tomb decorations. One famous limestone ostracon from Deir el-Medina shows a cat bringing a dressed duck to its human, essentially a cat bringing dead things home, joke that's still relatable 3,000 years later. This suggests some cats enjoyed privileged positions in households beyond their utilitarian value as pest controllers. But this kind of special treatment for individual animals is a far cry from systematic religious worship. It's more comparable to modern pet owners having their beloved animals taxidermied or keeping their ashes in special urns. Expressions of attachment rather than religious devotion. No matter how much you love your golden retriever, you probably don't build temples to honor its divine essence. The cat worship myth reveals our tendency to reduce complex ancient cultures to simplistic, often patronizing caricatures. It's easier to imagine ancient Egyptians as primitive people worshiping household pets than to engage with their sophisticated theological systems that used animal imagery to represent complex cosmic principles. This reductionism says more about our need to feel superior to past civilizations than it does about actual Egyptian religious practices. We comfort ourselves with the notion that earlier societies were simpler and more primitive, those silly Egyptians with their cat gods and eyeliner, rather than acknowledging that they developed complex, internally consistent belief systems that were appropriate to their cultural context and no more inherently primitive than many modern religious beliefs. After all, from an outsider's perspective, many contemporary religious practices might seem equally baffling if reduced to simplistic summaries. The real relationship between cats and religion in ancient Egypt evolved significantly over time, reflecting broader changes in Egyptian society and religious practice. In the Old Kingdom, cats weren't particularly prominent in religious iconography, with lions and other big cats holding greater symbolic importance. By the Middle Kingdom, domestic cats began appearing more frequently in art and texts, gradually gaining cultural significance. It was really during the New Kingdom and later periods that the cat-headed version of Batet became widely popular, coinciding with the rise of more personal forms of religious expression accessible to ordinary Egyptians rather than just the elite. The massive industry of cat mummification that developed during the late period represented yet another evolution, driven partly by economic factors as temples found lucrative revenue streams in selling mummified offerings. This complex historical development gets completely flattened in the simplistic Egyptians worship cats narrative, which treats Egyptian civilization as a monolithic entity rather than a culture that evolved over thousands of years. Perhaps the most persistent aspect of the cat worship myth is the notion that Egyptians believed cats had supernatural powers, that they could see ghosts, ward off evil spirits, or serve as conduits to the divine realm. While cats were associated with protective qualities, this wasn't because Egyptians thought each individual cat had mystical powers. Rather, cats symbolically represented divine protection through their natural behaviors, controlling dangerous pests, killing snakes, and defending territories. Their ability to see in near darkness and their mysterious, self-contained nature made them appropriate symbols for divine watchfulness and supernatural protection. But this symbolism didn't mean Egyptians thought Mr. Whiskers was personally responsible for keeping demons away from the grain storage. It was what cats represented, not what they were, that held religious significance. This distinction is crucial for understanding Egyptian religious thought, which operated through elaborate systems of symbolism and correspondence rather than direct identification. The next time someone confidently informs you that ancient Egyptians worshiped cats, you can enlighten them about the complex reality. Egyptians had a multifaceted relationship with cats as valuable working animals, occasional pets, symbols of divine qualities, and eventually industrial-scale religious offerings. They depicted one goddess with a cat's head to represent her qualities, not because they thought cats themselves were divine beings demanding worship. The notion that an entire sophisticated civilization organized itself around cat worship isn't just wrong. It's a disservice to one of history's most theologically complex and intellectually rigorous cultures. Ancient Egyptians had an intricate religious system addressing fundamental questions of existence, cosmic order, ethics, and the afterlife. Reducing this to "they worship cats" is like summarizing all of modern physics as smart people think stuff moves. Technically not entirely wrong, but missing so much that it becomes misleading. Besides, if Egyptians truly worshiped cats, they'd have left far more evidence, like massive cat-shaped monuments, cat hymns, or at least one papyrus containing the ancient Egyptian equivalent of "I can has cheeseburger." The archaeological record is surprisingly lacking in ancient cat memes for a civilization supposedly organized around feline adoration. Another persistent myth about ancient Egypt is that hieroglyphics were some mysterious, impenetrable code that took superhuman genius to crack. According to this dramatic narrative, hieroglyphs remained completely indecipherable for nearly 1,500 years until the dashing young scholar Jean-François Champollion had a sudden eureka moment with the Rosetta Stone, instantly translating the ancient script while dramatically clutching his chest before collapsing from the sheer intellectual exertion. He reportedly ran to his brother's office shouting, "I've got it," before fainting from exhaustion, a level of academic drama we just don't see enough of in modern research publications. This romanticized version of events makes for great cinema, but misses the complex reality of how hieroglyphs were actually deciphered, and the fact that they weren't designed to be mysterious in the first place. Hieroglyphs weren't a secret code or mystical symbols. They were a practical writing system used for everything from religious texts to tax receipts, inventory lists, and even graffiti. Ancient Egyptians weren't writing cryptic messages for future archaeologists to puzzle over. They were recording the same mundane information that fills our own documents. Who owes what to whom, which pharaoh dedicated which temple, and occasionally which scribe thinks his colleague is a donkey's behind. The writing system evolved to meet the practical needs of a complex civilization, with signs representing both phonetic sounds and concepts. It wasn't inherently more difficult than other ancient writing systems. It just had the misfortune of falling out of use entirely, with the last known hieroglyphic inscription dating to 394 CE. Imagine if English disappeared tomorrow. Future archaeologists might find our alphabet equally baffling without living speakers or intermediate text to guide them. The decipherment of hieroglyphs wasn't the work of a single genius, but a collaborative intellectual project spanning decades. While Champollion deservedly gets credit for the crucial breakthrough, he built on the work of many scholars before him. Thomas Young had already identified several phonetic values. George Zoega correctly guessed that cartouches contained royal names, and Sylvestre de Sacy made important observations about the demotic script. The Rosetta Stone itself, discovered in 1799 during Napoleon's Egyptian campaign, provided a trilingual inscription, hieroglyphic, demotic, and ancient Greek, that gave scholars their first reliable starting point. Champollion's breakthrough came in 1822, but even afterward, it took many more years of work by numerous scholars to fully understand the complexities of the writing system. The real story isn't one of mystical codes finally yielding to genius, but of systematic scholarly analysis gradually reconstructing knowledge of a lost language, which is actually more impressive than the mythologized version. What made hieroglyphs challenging to decipher wasn't inherent complexity, but the lack of continuity. Most ancient writing systems either evolved into modern ones or were recorded and translated by contemporaries who understood them. Cuneiform was deciphered partly through bilingual inscriptions and partly through languages like Old Persian that provided links to known languages. Linear B, ancient Mycenaean Greek, was decoded because it represented an early form of Greek that had continuity with classical Greek. But hieroglyphs faced a perfect storm of discontinuity. The writing system was eventually replaced by Demotic, then Coptic, which used Greek letters. The Egyptian language evolved dramatically. Christianity replaced ancient Egyptian religion, and the Arab conquest brought Arabic to Egypt. By the medieval period, even Egyptians themselves couldn't read hieroglyphs from their past. It would be like future archaeologists trying to decipher English after our civilization collapsed, and was replaced by 3 successive cultures with different languages and writing systems. The perception of hieroglyphs as mystical or magical symbols was largely a Greek invention, later amplified by Renaissance scholars. The word hieroglyph itself comes from Greek, meaning sacred carving, reflecting the Greeks' observation that this script appeared primarily on temple walls and religious objects, because those were made of stone and thus survived, while everyday papyri mostly didn't. Late antique and medieval scholars, lacking the tools to properly understand the script, developed elaborate theories about hieroglyphs as philosophical symbols containing hidden wisdom. Horapollo's 5th century CE text, Hieroglyphica, provided fanciful interpretations that were taken as authoritative by Renaissance scholars, leading to an entire tradition of hieroglyphic studies that had almost nothing to do with how the writing system actually worked. It's a bit like if future scholars, unable to read English, decided that the McDonald's logo was a mystical symbol representing the cosmic arches connecting heaven and earth, rather than a stylized letter marking a place to get mediocre burgers. What makes the actual decipherment so impressive is the methodical, scientific approach that finally succeeded where mystical interpretations had failed. Champollion's breakthrough came from comparing the names of Ptolemy and Cleopatra across different inscriptions, identifying phonetic values for individual signs, and then applying these values to other names. His knowledge of Coptic, the final stage of the Egyptian language, written with Greek letters, was crucial as it allowed him to reconstruct the approximate sounds of ancient Egyptian words. The process was more like code breaking than mystical insight, requiring pattern recognition, comparison of multiple examples, and testing of hypotheses against new data. It was ultimately a triumph of Enlightenment scientific methodology over medieval mysticism. The romantic image of sudden inspiration makes for better storytelling, but the reality, systematic analysis leading to incremental breakthroughs, better reflects how human knowledge actually advances. Once deciphered, hieroglyphs revealed not mystical wisdom, but the everyday workings of an ancient civilization. Some of the earliest translated texts included thrilling content such as inventories of temple donations, lists of military campaigns, and records of mining expeditions. While religious texts certainly existed, much of what was written in hieroglyphs was administrative in nature, the ancient equivalent of spreadsheets, memos, and expense reports. Even the famous Book of the Dead was essentially a practical guide to navigating the afterlife, complete with useful spells for specific situations you might encounter while dead. It was less mystical revelation and more afterlife for dummies, providing step-by-step instructions for such essential skills as how to not have your heart eaten by Amit the Soul Devourer, and transforming into a divine falcon without reading the instructions first and accidentally becoming a divine pigeon instead. The hieroglyphic writing system itself was remarkably flexible and practical. It consisted of about 700 signs used in various ways. Some represented single consonants, alphabetic. Some represented pairs of consonants, syllabic, and others represented whole words or concepts, logograms or determinatives. Scribes could write the same word using different combinations of signs, sometimes for space constraints and sometimes just for aesthetic variation. Hieroglyphs could be written horizontally or vertically, right to left or left to right, depending on the artistic composition of the monument or document. This wasn't to confuse readers, but to integrate text seamlessly with visual art, a design feature, not a cryptographic one. Modern designers struggling with responsive layouts for different screen sizes might actually learn something from ancient Egyptian scribes, who were solving similar problems of adaptive text placement over 4,000 years ago. What's perhaps most ironic about the mysterious hieroglyphs myth is that ancient Egyptians themselves didn't consider their writing particularly mysterious or restricted. While literacy rates were low by modern standards, estimated at around 1 to 3% of the population, this was true of all ancient societies and reflected economic realities rather than deliberate knowledge restriction. Hieroglyphs appeared on public monuments meant to be seen by everyone, even if not everyone could read them. More complicated texts were written in hieratic, a cursive form of hieroglyphs, and later demotic, an even more simplified script, which were more practical for everyday writing on papyrus. Professional scribes underwent years of training, copying texts and learning standard formulations. But this was more like modern professional education than initiation into mystical secrets. The idea of hieroglyphs as esoteric knowledge restricted to initiates is largely a Greek projection, not how Egyptians themselves viewed their writing system. The legacy of the mysterious hieroglyphs myth persists in popular culture, from adventure movies where deciphering an inscription reveals the location of ancient treasure to New Age systems that appropriate hieroglyphic symbols for supposed mystical purposes. What these representations miss is that the real value of deciphering hieroglyphs wasn't finding hidden wisdom or secret knowledge, but gaining direct access to how an ancient civilization recorded its own history, beliefs, and daily life in its own words. Before hieroglyphs were deciphered, our understanding of ancient Egypt came primarily through Greek and Roman accounts. Outsider perspectives often filtered through cultural biases and misconceptions, much like the myths we're debunking in this very narrative. Reading hieroglyphs allowed Egyptians to speak for themselves across millennia, revealing a culture far more complex, practical, and recognizably human than the exotic stereotypes that had accumulated around them. So the next time you see hieroglyphs presented as mystical symbols containing the secrets of the universe, remember that you're looking at the ancient Egyptian equivalent of Arial or Times New Roman, a practical writing system designed for recording information, not concealing it. The ancient scribe who carefully inscribed those symbols would be baffled by our perception of their work as mysterious or magical. They were simply doing their job, recording tax payments or dedication inscriptions or medical treatments in the standard writing system of their time. The real mystery isn't what the hieroglyphs say, but why we remain so determined to see ancient civilizations as keepers of esoteric wisdom rather than practical people solving the same fundamental human problems we face today, just with different technologies and cultural frameworks. Perhaps it's easier to imagine ancient people possessing magical knowledge than to accept that human progress isn't always linear, and that ancient civilizations sometimes developed sophisticated solutions to problems that we still struggle with today. Let's talk about ancient Egyptian medicine, which popular imagination has transformed into either primitive mumbo-jumbo involving eye of newt and wing of bat, or conversely, some kind of lost super advanced healing system that modern pharmaceutical companies are desperately hiding from us. According to the myth, Egyptian physicians were either glorified, witch doctors chanting spells while patients died of paper cuts, or they possessed miraculous medical knowledge far beyond our own, curing cancer with sacred oils while secretly understanding germ theory and antibiotics. The truth, as usual, lies somewhere in the messy middle. Egyptian medicine was a fascinating blend of practical observation and religious framework that was neither as primitive as skeptics suggest, nor as miraculously advanced as New Age health gurus would have you believe. Ancient Egyptian medical practice was documented in several papyri that have survived, including the Edwin Smith Surgical Papyrus, the Ebers Papyrus, and the Kahin Gynecological Papyrus. These texts reveal a medical system that combined empirical observation with religious and magical elements. Not because Egyptians couldn't tell the difference, but because they saw no contradiction between them. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, for instance, contains surprisingly rational descriptions of 48 traumatic injuries, including detailed examination techniques, diagnoses, prognosis, and treatments. Each case follows a consistent format. If you examine a man with injury, followed by observable symptoms, then a verdict, an ailment I will treat, an ailment I will fight with, or an ailment not to be treated, an early form of triage recognizing that some conditions were beyond their ability to treat. This is hardly the approach of superstitious witch doctors, but rather the systematic methodology of trained medical professionals working within the constraints of their knowledge and technology. Egyptian physicians had a surprisingly accurate understanding of anatomy thanks to the mummification process, which gave them unparalleled opportunities to observe the internal structures of the human body. They recognized the importance of the pulse and its connection to the heart, understood that blood vessels carried blood throughout the body, and identified many internal organs and their general functions. Their knowledge wasn't complete by modern standards. They believed the heart, rather than the brain, was the seat of thought and emotion, for instance. But they were observant enough to note correlations between injuries to specific body parts and resulting symptoms. The Edwin Smith Papyrus describes brain injuries with remarkable accuracy, noting that damage to one side of the brain could cause paralysis on the opposite side of the body, a fundamental neurological principle that wouldn't be rediscovered in European medicine until centuries later. Not bad for supposed primitives who were allegedly too busy building alien landing pads to develop proper medical science. Contrary to popular belief, Egyptian physicians didn't just mumble spells and hope for the best. They employed a wide range of practical treatments that made logical sense given their understanding of the body. They used honey as an antibacterial wound dressing, a practice so effective that modern medicine has actually returned to it for treating antibiotic-resistant infections. They applied moldy bread to wounds, potentially utilizing the same antibiotic properties that would later lead to the development of penicillin. They set broken bones with splints, stitched wounds, and used willow bark, which contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin, for pain relief. These weren't random guesses, but the results of centuries of observation and experience, passed down through generations of medical practitioners. The magical incantations and appeals to deities came in addition to these practical treatments, not instead of them. The ancient equivalent of a modern surgeon, both using their medical training and saying, "I'll pray for you," to a patient. The Egyptian medical system was remarkably specialized and organized for its time. Medical practitioners included physicians, priests of Sekhmet, who dealt with epidemics, scorpion charmers, who treated venomous bites, and various specialists for specific body parts. There were doctors of the eyes, the belly, the teeth, and so on. This specialization suggests a sophisticated approach to healthcare rather than generalized magical thinking. There's evidence of medical schools associated with temples, where physicians trained through a combination of practical apprenticeship and study of medical texts. Famous physicians received recognition throughout the Mediterranean world. Imhotep, who lived around 2600 BCE, was so renowned that he was later deified as the god of medicine and healing. 2,000 years after his death, Greek physicians still honored his contributions, suggesting his methods had demonstrable effectiveness rather than just religious significance. Egyptian pharmacology was extensive and sophisticated, utilizing hundreds of medicinal substances derived from plants, animals, and minerals. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest and most complete medical documents from ancient Egypt, lists over 700 remedies for various conditions. Some of these remedies contained effective active ingredients that modern pharmacology has validated. For instance, they used opium for pain relief, castor oil as a laxative, and garlic for its antibacterial properties. Others were less effective or even potentially harmful, like using lead-based compounds for skin conditions. But this mix of effective and ineffective treatments isn't unique to ancient medicine. Look at any 19th century medical textbook, and you'll find similar combinations of genuinely useful remedies alongside completely ineffective or harmful ones. Medical knowledge advances through trial and error over generations, and the Egyptians were actively engaged in this process, not simply relying on unchanging tradition. Where Egyptian medicine gets its undeserved reputation for being primarily magical comes from the religious framework in which these practical treatments were delivered. Diagnosis often involved both physical examination and determining which deity might be involved in causing the illness. Treatment could include both practical remedies and appeals to appropriate gods or protective amulets. But this integration of religious and practical elements doesn't mean the Egyptians couldn't distinguish between them. They simply saw disease and healing as operating on multiple levels simultaneously, with physical and spiritual dimensions that both needed addressing. It's not fundamentally different from a modern religious person both taking prescribed medication and praying for recovery, or a contemporary doctor treating the physical symptoms while acknowledging the psychological and emotional aspects of illness. The Egyptians just formalized this holistic approach within their medical system rather than treating them as separate domains. What's particularly interesting about Egyptian medicine is how it influenced later medical traditions. Greek physicians like Hippocrates and Galen studied Egyptian medical texts and practices, absorbing their systematic approach to diagnosis and treatment, while gradually shifting toward more naturalistic explanations of disease. Egyptian pharmacological knowledge passed into Greek, Roman, and eventually medieval European and Islamic medical traditions, with many Egyptian remedies remaining in use for thousands of years. Even the famous physician symbol, the caduceus, or more correctly, the rod of Asclepius, has potential connections to Egyptian healing symbols. Rather than being isolated in its development or practice, Egyptian medicine was part of a continuous tradition of medical knowledge that evolved over centuries through exchange with other cultures. It wasn't lost ancient wisdom that disappeared with the pharaohs, but part of the foundation upon which modern medicine eventually built. The reality of Egyptian medicine challenges both extremes of the myth. It wasn't primarily magical mumbo-jumbo with no practical value, nor was it miraculously advanced beyond what we'd expect from a pre-scientific civilization. Egyptian physicians were careful observers who developed effective treatments for many conditions within the constraints of their technological capabilities and conceptual framework. They performed successful surgeries, set broken bones, treated wounds, prepared effective medications, and recognized when certain conditions were beyond their ability to treat. At the same time, they operated without germ theory, antibiotics, anesthesia, or a complete understanding of human physiology, which limited what they could achieve. Their integration of religious elements wasn't a failure to distinguish between natural and supernatural causation, but a coherent approach to healing that addressed what they perceived as multiple dimensions of illness and wellness. Perhaps the most persistently misunderstood aspect of Egyptian medicine is the relationship between magic and practical treatments. Modern perspectives often assume that magical elements must indicate primitive thinking or superstition. But this imposes our cultural categories on a civilization that conceptualized reality differently. For Egyptians, magic, Heka, wasn't opposed to natural causation, but was an integral force in the cosmos that could be harnessed through proper knowledge and techniques. More like an additional branch of physics than a rejection of natural law. Medical treatments involved Heka, not because physicians couldn't explain natural processes, but because they saw magical forces as part of those natural processes. Spells and incantations were used alongside willow bark and honey because both were considered effective in their respective domains. This integrated approach makes perfect sense within the Egyptian worldview, even if it doesn't align with modern scientific categories. So the next time someone tries to sell you an ancient Egyptian healing secret, promising miraculous cures, or conversely dismisses Egyptian medicine as nothing but superstition and magic, remember the reality was more complex and interesting than either extreme. Egyptian physicians were neither primitive witch doctors nor secret possessors of medical knowledge surpassing our own. They were skilled practitioners working within the knowledge framework of their time, making careful observations, developing effective treatments, and yes, embedding their practice within their cultural and religious understanding of the world, just as all medical systems do, including our own. Their achievements are impressive enough without mythologizing them into either direction of the spectrum. And if there's one lesson we might actually learn from Egyptian medicine, it's the value of a holistic approach that recognizes both the physical and psychological aspects of healing, rather than treating them as entirely separate domains. Sometimes the ancients got things right not because they had secret knowledge, but because they were paying attention to aspects of human experience that more advanced systems sometimes overlook in their specialization and compartmentalization. Another pervasive myth about ancient Egypt is that they were primitively obsessed with the afterlife while having no concept of enjoying the present life. According to this distorted view, Egyptians were essentially depressing death cultists who spent their entire lives as joyless architects of their own tombs, counting down the days until they could permanently exchange the warm sunshine of the Nile Valley for the dark confines of an underground burial chamber. Nothing could be further from the truth. Ancient Egyptians actually had a vibrant, sophisticated, and remarkably modern approach to the concept of pleasure. They just didn't post about it on Instagram with carefully filtered photos of their avocado toast in the Royal Garden cafes of Memphis and Thebes. Archaeological evidence reveals that ancient Egyptians were not only familiar with the concept of having a good time, but had elevated it to an art form that would make modern hedonists look like amateurs. They brewed at least 17 varieties of beer, not counting seasonal specialties and limited pharaonic editions, produced wines from grapes, dates, and other fruits, and developed a cuisine sophisticated enough that their recipes were collected and copied throughout the ancient Mediterranean. Banquets featured not just elaborate food and drink, but live music, dancing, flower arrangements, and party favors for guests. The Tomb of Nebuchadnezzar includes famous scenes of a banquet with musicians, dancers, and servants offering wine to elegantly dressed guests who were clearly having a much better time than you did at your last office holiday party. These weren't somber, death-focused gatherings, but joyous celebrations of life's pleasures. The ancient equivalent of living your best life, several millennia before that phrase became an insufferable social media caption. Sexual pleasure was also openly acknowledged and celebrated in ancient Egyptian culture, without the layers of shame and repression that later religious traditions would impose. Love poetry from ancient Egypt is surprisingly direct and passionate, with lines that would make a modern romance novelist blush. To hear your voice is pomegranate wine to me. I draw life from hearing it. Could I see you with every glance? It would be better for me than to eat or to drink. They had specific terms for various sexual acts, depicted erotic scenes in their art, and included spells for enhancing sexual pleasure in their medical texts. Fertility was celebrated, but sex was clearly recognized as something to be enjoyed for its own sake, not just for reproduction. They developed early forms of contraception, including pessaries made from honey, acacia leaves, and other substances that modern research has shown actually had spermicidal properties. This wasn't a culture afraid of pleasure or saving it all for the afterlife. They were determined to enjoy themselves thoroughly in the here and now, with the afterlife essentially planned as a continuation of these earthly delights. Music, dance, and games were integral parts of Egyptian daily life, not merely reserved for special occasions. Egyptians played board games like Senet and Mehen, had ball games and other athletic competitions, and engaged in activities like fishing and hunting for both practical purposes and recreation. Musicians were highly regarded, with specialized training and recognized professional status. Instruments included harps, lutes, pipes, sistrums, a type of rattle, and drums, used in both religious ceremonies and secular entertainment. Dance was similarly valued, with professional dancers hired for performances at banquets and festivals. These weren't grim-faced people obsessed with death, but a culture that embraced entertainment, competition, and artistic expression as essential components of a well-lived life. They would have understood perfectly our modern concept of work-life balance, though they might have questioned why we seem to emphasize the work part so heavily compared to the life part. Egyptians even had vacation homes and pleasure gardens, the ancient equivalent of weekend getaways. Wealthy Egyptians maintained estates with artificial lakes, imported trees, flower gardens, and pavilions designed specifically for relaxation and entertainment. These weren't spaces for somber contemplation of mortality, but venues for enjoying life's pleasures in beautiful surroundings. Love poetry often uses these garden settings as backdrops for romantic encounters, highlighting their association with pleasure and sensuality. Archaeological evidence from sites like Amarna shows homes with garden courts, pools, and areas designated for entertainment. Features designed for enjoying the present moment, not fixating on the afterlife. Even their preparation for death reflected this love of life. Tomb decorations often depicted favorite activities the deceased hoped to continue enjoying eternally, from banqueting and hunting to playing with beloved pets and spending time with family members. Speaking of pets, Egyptians had deeply affectionate relationships with their animal companions that would be immediately recognizable to any modern pet owner. They kept cats, dogs, monkeys, gazelles, and even baboons as household pets, giving them names like Sweet One or Brave One, adorning them with decorative collars, and sometimes mummifying them to ensure their beloved animals would join them in the afterlife. Tomb paintings show pets under their owners' chairs or on their laps, clearly depicted as valued family members rather than mere possessions. One particularly touching ancient poem laments the death of a beloved cat. The children weep over their father, the mother over her beloved, all the household over their master. This isn't the sentiment of people who viewed animals as mere symbols or who were too focused on the afterlife to form attachments in the present. It's the universal human experience of loving and mourning a pet, as recognizable today as it was 3,000 years ago. Egyptian concepts of beauty and self-care would put modern influencers to shame. They developed elaborate cosmetics, perfumes, and beauty treatments, including hair care products, skin moisturizers, and makeup with both aesthetic and practical purposes, like kohl eyeliner that helped reduce glare from the sun. They created jewelry in gold, silver, and precious stones with designs so timeless that they wouldn't look out of place in a contemporary luxury boutique. Clothing was made from linen of varying qualities, with the finest being nearly transparent and reserved for the elite. These weren't people dressing for the grave, but individuals who cared deeply about their appearance and sensory experiences. The resources devoted to beauty products, fashion, and adornment in ancient Egypt suggest a culture that placed high value on aesthetic pleasure and sensory enjoyment, a far cry from the stereotype of death-obsessed ascetics building tombs while ignoring the joys of embodied existence. Even their religious festivals combined spiritual devotion with considerable earthly pleasure. The beautiful Festival of the Valley, for instance, involved visiting ancestors' tombs, but was characterized by feasting, music, drinking, and general revelry rather than somber mourning. The Festival of Drunkenness, dedicated to the goddess Hathor, involved ritual intoxication as a religious practice. Participants would drink to the point of seeing visions, celebrating the goddess's power through intentional altered states. Other festivals featured processions, feasting, dancing, and public celebrations that combined religious significance with community enjoyment. These weren't purely solemn religious observances, but communal experiences that acknowledged pleasure as a legitimate aspect of spiritual practice. The Egyptians understood something that many later religious traditions would forget or actively suppress: that joy, pleasure, and celebration could be sacred experiences in themselves, not distractions from spiritual pursuits. What's particularly fascinating about Egyptian attitudes toward pleasure is their integration of enjoyment with moral and social responsibility. The concept of ma'at, truth, balance, and cosmic order, included the idea that proper enjoyment of life's pleasures was part of living correctly, not opposed to it. Excessive asceticism was no more in line with ma'at than excessive indulgence. The ideal was balanced enjoyment within the context of social harmony and ethical behavior. Wisdom texts advised enjoying life's pleasures while maintaining proper conduct. Follow your desire as long as you live, and do not perform more than is ordered. What they the dead love is for their names to be pronounced by the living. This wasn't an invitation to selfish hedonism, but recognition that enjoyment of life was compatible with, even essential to, living ethically and maintaining social bonds. It was sophisticated ethical hedonism millennia before philosophers would formally articulate such concepts. This balanced approach to pleasure is perhaps best illustrated by Egyptian attitudes toward alcohol, particularly beer, which was a dietary staple consumed by people of all social classes. Beer was recognized as both nutritionally valuable and pleasurable, used in religious rituals, medical treatments, and daily meals. Drunkenness was depicted in art and mentioned in texts, sometimes with moral cautions against excess, but often with humor and acceptance as a normal part of celebrations. One famous text, The Tale of the Eloquent Peasant, mentions people becoming drunk on beer at festivals without moral condemnation. Another text advises students to avoid excessive drinking that would lead them to forget their teachings, suggesting moderation rather than abstinence. This nuanced view recognized that pleasure wasn't inherently problematic, but needed to be enjoyed within appropriate contexts and limits. A remarkably balanced perspective that avoided both the extreme asceticism and consequence-free indulgence that characterize some modern approaches to pleasure. The myth of Egyptians as joyless death obsessives says more about the cultural biases of those who perpetuate it than about ancient Egypt itself. It reflects our modern discomfort with cultures that integrated death awareness in a daily life rather than compartmentalizing or denying mortality, as we often do. The Egyptians didn't fixate on death at the expense of life. They recognized death as part of life's cycle and developed elaborate practices to address the anxieties this recognition naturally provokes. Their afterlife beliefs weren't evidence of death obsession, but of a deep commitment to continued existence and enjoyment. They weren't building tombs because they loved death. They were building tombs because they loved life so much they wanted it to continue forever. The real Egyptian attitude might be better summarized as, life is wonderful, so why stop at just one? Their pleasure-positive, death-aware philosophy actually represents a more integrated and psychologically healthy approach than our modern tendency to maximize pleasure while pretending mortality doesn't exist until it's unavoidably thrust upon us. So the next time someone characterizes ancient Egyptians as grim death cultists who never knew how to have fun, remind them that these were people who created 17 varieties of beer, wrote passionate love poetry, developed multiple board games, held festivals specifically dedicated to ritual intoxication, maintained pleasure gardens with artificial lakes, and decorated their eternal homes with scenes of their favorite earthly parties. They weren't storing up their joy for the afterlife. They were determined to experience as much pleasure as possible in this life, and then continue the party eternally in the next. If anything, we modern humans with our burnout culture, workaholic tendencies, and endless productivity guilt might have more to learn from the ancient Egyptians about balanced hedonism than they would have to learn from us. They understood something that we often forget in our frenetic modern existence. That pleasure isn't a guilty indulgence or a distraction from what matters, but an essential component of a well-lived life, as worthy of attention, cultivation, and celebration as any other human pursuit. Let's tackle our final myth: the notion that ancient Egypt was an isolated civilization, developing in splendid seclusion along the Nile, untouched by outside influences and maintaining pure Egyptianness for thousands of years. This isolationist fantasy portrays Egyptians as xenophobic purists who rejected foreign contact while creating a completely indigenous culture. Meanwhile, the archaeological evidence tells a completely different story. Ancient Egypt was more connected, cosmopolitan, and multicultural than most people realize. Think less isolated desert kingdom, and more ancient Mediterranean melting pot with trade networks, diplomatic relations, and cultural exchanges that would make a modern globalization expert nod in approval. The Egyptian civilization wasn't built behind walls, but through constant interaction with their neighbors, incorporating foreign ideas, technologies, and even people throughout their long history. From its earliest beginnings, Egypt was engaged in trade and cultural exchange with distant lands. Archaeological evidence shows contact with Mesopotamia, the Levant, and Nubia even in pre-dynastic times, around 3500 BCE. By the Old Kingdom, Egypt was importing cedar wood from Lebanon, gold and incense from Nubia, and luxury goods from throughout the eastern Mediterranean. They weren't isolationists, but enthusiastic participants in the ancient equivalent of global trade, sending expeditions to places like Punt, possibly modern Somalia or Ethiopia, and establishing trading colonies in the Levant. The famous expedition to Punt depicted in Queen Hatshepsut's mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari shows Egyptians bringing back exotic plants, animals, and trade goods, demonstrating their eagerness to acquire foreign products and knowledge. These weren't people building walls to keep foreigners out, but a civilization actively seeking contact, exchange, and valuable resources from distant lands. Egyptian art and architecture show clear evidence of foreign influences throughout their history. The Step Pyramid of Djoser, often considered the first monumental stone building in Egypt, shows design elements borrowed from earlier Mesopotamian ziggurats adapted to Egyptian religious concepts. During the New Kingdom, Egyptian artists incorporated stylistic elements from Minoan Crete and Mycenaean Greece into their work. Luxury goods from the Aegean, Cyprus, and the Near East have been found in Egyptian tombs, showing appreciation for foreign craftsmanship and aesthetic styles. Even the famous Egyptian Sphinx combines elements from different cultures. The concept of a human-headed lion has Mesopotamian origins, but was thoroughly Egyptianized into one of their most iconic symbols. This wasn't a civilization rigidly rejecting outside influences, but one that confidently incorporated foreign elements, while adapting them to fit Egyptian cultural frameworks. They were cultural appropriators in the best sense, taking what they found valuable from other traditions and integrating it into their own distinctive style. The Egyptian language itself bears witness to this cosmopolitan exchange, incorporating numerous loan words from neighboring languages throughout its history. Terms for certain technologies, plants, animals, and cultural practices entered Egyptian from languages like Semitic, Nubian, Greek, and Persian as Egyptians adopted new ideas and needed vocabulary to describe them. By the New Kingdom, diplomatic correspondence was often conducted in Akkadian, the international language of the time. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of English in modern diplomacy, showing Egyptian participation in the broader Middle Eastern diplomatic system. During the late period, Greek and Demotic Egyptian were used side by side in administration, and after Alexander's conquest, trilingual inscriptions in hieroglyphic Egyptian, Demotic, and Greek, like the famous Rosetta Stone, became common. This wasn't linguistic isolation, but pragmatic multilingualism adapting to changing political and cultural realities. Egypt's royal families were far from the pure-blooded pharaonic lineages depicted in popular imagination. Royal marriages with foreign princesses were common diplomatic practice, bringing women from Mitanni, Babylon, Hutti, and other powerful states into the Egyptian royal household. The famous Amarna letters include correspondence about such marriage arrangements, showing they were important aspects of international relations. Some pharaohs had foreign mothers or grandmothers, making them literally half Egyptian. During certain periods, Egypt was ruled by dynasties of entirely foreign origin. The Hyksos from the Levant, Nubians from modern Sudan, Libyans from the West, Persians from Iran, Greeks after Alexander, and finally Romans. Rather than rejecting these foreign rulers entirely, Egyptian culture typically absorbed them into pharaonic traditions, with foreign kings adopting Egyptian royal titles, imagery, and religious practices while sometimes maintaining elements of their own cultural identities. This was an ethnic purity but remarkable cultural adaptability. Even the Egyptian pantheon wasn't isolated from foreign influences. Gods and goddesses from neighboring cultures were adopted into Egyptian religion throughout its history. The Syrian goddess Astarte, the Semitic god Baal, and various Nubian deities were incorporated into Egyptian worship, sometimes identified with existing Egyptian gods, and sometimes maintained as distinct divine entities. During the New Kingdom, Canaanite deities like Resheph and Kadesh appear in Egyptian religious imagery. Later, Greek gods were syncretized with Egyptian counterparts, creating hybrid divine identities like Serapis, combining Osiris and Apis with Greek elements. Rather than rejecting foreign deities as invalid or threatening, Egyptian religion showed remarkable openness to incorporating divine beings from other traditions, recognizing them as different manifestations of cosmic powers rather than competing religious claims. This theological cosmopolitanism stands in sharp contrast to the exclusive monotheism that would later develop in the region. Egypt's population itself was far more diverse than popular imagination suggests. As a geographic crossroads between Africa, Asia, and the Mediterranean, Egypt naturally saw immigration, voluntary and involuntary, throughout its history. Foreign merchants established communities in Egyptian cities, particularly in the Delta region. Mercenary soldiers from Libya, Nubia, the Aegean, and the Near East serve in Egyptian armies and often settled permanently. Enslaved or captured people from military campaigns were incorporated into Egyptian society. Analysis of skeletal remains from various periods shows considerable genetic diversity rather than a homogeneous population. By the late period, major Egyptian cities like Memphis and Alexandria were thoroughly multicultural, with distinct neighborhoods for different ethnic communities and multiple languages spoken in the streets. This wasn't racial or ethnic isolation, but a dynamic, diverse society continuously incorporating new people and influences while maintaining its distinctive cultural core. What's particularly fascinating about Egyptian cosmopolitanism is how it balanced openness to foreign influences with maintenance of distinctive Egyptian cultural identity. Rather than either rejecting outside elements entirely or being culturally overwhelmed by them, Egyptians selectively adopted foreign ideas, technologies, artistic motifs, and even deities while adapting them to fit Egyptian cultural frameworks. This process of Egyptianization allowed the civilization to evolve and incorporate new elements while maintaining cultural continuity. Foreign gods were given Egyptian-style temples and imagery. Foreign words were written in hieroglyphs. Foreign rulers adopted pharaonic titles and regalia. This wasn't xenophobic resistance to change, but confident cultural assimilation of outside elements on Egyptian terms. It's remarkably similar to how modern global cultures like the United States or Japan incorporate foreign influences while adapting them to fit their own cultural contexts and values. The myth of Egyptian isolation reveals more about modern nationalist ideologies than ancient realities. The 19th and early 20th century saw the rise of ethnic nationalism, with its emphasis on cultural purity, indigenous origins, and resistance to foreign contamination. Archaeological discoveries in Egypt were often interpreted through this nationalist lens, with scholars emphasizing the indigenous development of Egyptian civilization while downplaying evidence of foreign connections or influences. Egyptian archaeological sites became symbols in competing colonial narratives about racial characteristics and civilizational capabilities. These interpretative frameworks said more about modern political concerns than ancient Egyptian realities. More recent scholarship, less burdened by these nationalist assumptions, has increasingly recognized the connected, cosmopolitan nature of ancient Egyptian civilization within its broader Mediterranean and African contexts. What makes this myth particularly ironic is that it misses one of the most impressive aspects of ancient Egyptian civilization: its remarkable ability to maintain cultural continuity while constantly adapting to new circumstances and influences. For over 3,000 years, Egyptian civilization maintained recognizable continuity in language, religion, artistic conventions, and political structures despite continuous interaction with foreign cultures and periodic rule by foreign dynasties. This wasn't achieved through isolation or rejection of outside influences, but through confident cultural assimilation, incorporating useful or appealing foreign elements while adapting them to fit existing Egyptian frameworks and values. It's a model of cultural resilience through adaptive integration rather than rigid preservation, maintaining identity not by building walls, but by selectively incorporating outside elements on their own terms. In our current era of globalization anxiety and cultural identity politics, this ancient Egyptian approach to maintaining cultural continuity through confident, selective adaptation rather than fearful isolation offers a fascinating historical perspective. So the next time someone portrays ancient Egypt as an isolated civilization developing in splendid seclusion along the Nile, remember that the archaeological evidence tells a different story of a dynamic, connected society engaged in trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. Their monuments weren't built by people hiding from foreign contact, but by a civilization at the crossroads of ancient globalization, incorporating ideas, technologies, and even people from distant lands while maintaining their distinctive cultural identity. What made Egyptian civilization remarkable wasn't isolation, but precisely the opposite: its ability to remain recognizably Egyptian while continuously evolving through interaction with the wider world. It's a historical model that challenges both extreme nationalism, with its myths of cultural purity, and uncritical globalism, with its erasure of distinctive cultural identities. The ancient Egyptians weren't xenophobic isolationists or identity-less globalists, but something more interesting and instructive: a civilization that remained distinctively themselves precisely by remaining open to the world around them. And with that final myth thoroughly debunked, we've completed our journey through the misconceptions that cloud our understanding of ancient Egypt. From slave-built pyramids to alien interventions, from death-obsessed Goth culture to isolated pyramid builders, we've seen how popular imagination has distorted this fascinating civilization almost beyond recognition. The real ancient Egypt, with its skilled workers, pragmatic engineering, vibrant pleasure-seeking culture, and cosmopolitan outlook, was far more complex, sophisticated, and recognizably human than the cardboard cutout version that populates movies and internet memes. Perhaps that's the greatest myth of all: that ancient civilizations were fundamentally different from us, operating on alien logic we can barely comprehend. The truth is both more mundane and more profound. They were people like us, solving human problems with the resources and knowledge available to them, creating societies that were neither primitive stepping stones to our superior present nor possessors of lost supernatural wisdom we can only dimly comprehend. They were simply humans being human in their particular time and place, which is both less exotic and more relatable than the myths we've built around them.